In 1598, at the age of 71, Philip II of Spain was more than just a king. He was an architect who shaped the world. His Habsburg Spanish Empire was a vast geographical entity, so large that it was no exaggeration to claim that the sun never set on his dominions. From the enormous silver mines in Potosí, Peru, where wealth flowed ceaselessly to Madrid, to the distant fortresses of Manila, the Spanish Empire cast a great shadow across the globe. Inheriting the world's most immense throne from his father, Emperor Charles V, Philip governed with an iron will, forged in the holy fire of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Amidst all that greatness, Philip built El Escorial, a colossal, cold granite structure. El Escorial was not merely a palace. It was a monastery, a church, a library, and a royal mausoleum. It was a statement in stone about his power and piety, perfectly reflecting his own character, meticulous, resolute, and completely in control. He was a king of paper, rey papelero, a ruler whose power rested on his pen and signature, not the back of a warhorse. Yet, even as his power reached for the heavens, his body, within his austere room at El Escorial, began to rebel. The first sign of trouble did not come from an external enemy, but from an internal, silent and persistent foe, gout. The disease had tormented him for decades, but it had now progressed into a crippling form of arthritis, twisting his joints into agonizing, swollen masses. It not only caused severe pain, but also stripped him of his sovereign action, writing. By the end of his life, he was rendered almost completely paralyzed, a prisoner confined within his own rigid, contorted skeletal framework. This physical confinement only served to highlight Philip's obsession with control. Even as the pain threatened to drive him to delirium, he commanded his secretaries to bring massive piles of state documents to his bedside. In the dim lamplight, his gaunt face bent over the pages. With a simple, often single, shaky word, "No," he would determine the fate of a military campaign or a trade treaty. This was the final, desperate struggle between will and flesh. The horrific turning point came in June 1598. A persistent high fever weakened the king, leading to the eruption of large, painful, and recurring abscesses on his knees, hips, and right hand. These wounds would not heal. They constantly swelled, burst, and reformed, creating open reservoirs of infection. This was the clear sign that decomposition had already begun from within. His royal physicians, the best of their time, became his unwitting tormentors. Bound by the flawed humoral theory of antiquity, they relentlessly performed bloodletting to remove bad humors, further weakening the king. They also applied caustic poultices, likely containing irritants like arsenic, in a desperate attempt to clean the wounds. These interventions exacerbated the damage to the already inflamed tissues, widening the ulcers and accelerating the necrosis, effectively paving the way for further bacterial invasion. With the king's absolute immobility, his regal dignity utterly collapsed. The king, who enforced the strictest court protocol in Europe, was now entirely dependent on his servants for every basic function. The fall of court ritual was the first surrender of sovereignty. Philip often had to lie in his own waste because attendants could not change his lindens quickly enough. This was the ultimate humiliation for a man who valued royal prestige above all else. The divine ruler on earth was reduced to the barest, most pitiful biological need. As the infections deepened, the abscesses began to emit a terrible, overwhelming stench. This was the sickening odor of decaying flesh, pus, and waste, a noxious miasma so potent that even the most loyal courtiers struggled to maintain their composure. They had to constantly press perfumed handkerchiefs to their nose when entering the room. Most ironically, Philip, still lucid enough to feel the shame, ordered the windows to be kept closed to prevent the royal stench from escaping and contaminating the outside air. The stench served as an invitation to unspeakable guests. Lice first appeared, but the true horror was the arrival of maggots. Physicians recorded that the king's wounds began to exude putrid and corrupt matter in which many maggots were generated. These larvae from common flies found a perfect feast in the king's open wounds. Imagine the horrific scene: Philip II, fully conscious, forced to lie there, witnessing maggots wriggling within his sores, crawling out from underneath his skin. This was decomposition occurring before death, ante mortem. Daily, the attendants performed the gruesome ritual of removing the maggots, yet the next morning they would reappear in double the numbers, indicating the severe miasis. Absolute power was being defiled by the lowest biological organisms. The king's total immobility quickly resulted in massive grade 4 pressure ulcers, bed sores on his hip and lower back. These ulcers, exacerbated by moisture and a failing immune system, relentlessly ate through the skin, fat, muscle, and eventually exposed the bone itself. Fray José de Sigüenza recorded the shocking detail. The largest ulcer on the king's hip was fist-sized and reportedly opened into his internal cavity. This gigantic sore, a festering cave, was a separate, decaying ecosystem. From this wound alone, attendants removed enough putrid matter to fill 2 silver basins daily, a cruel juxtaposition of royal wealth against biological decay. Every movement was agonizing. Each time the servants had to turn the king for cleaning or dressing the wounds, a necessary act, Philippe would let out a shriek of extreme pain. The servants, though loyal, were emotionally tormented, forced to inflict torture upon the sovereign they revered. Amidst the horror, Philip's intellect remained sharp. This lucidity made him the perfect victim of the ordeal. He did not curse God. Instead, he embraced the intense suffering as divine penance for the sins he had committed during his reign in the name of the faith, including the brutalities of the Spanish Inquisition. He transformed his physical ordeal into a personal religious ritual. He demanded that Mass be celebrated daily, right inside his foul-smelling chamber. He clung fiercely to the wooden crucifix held by his father, Charles V, during his own death. His enduring faith transformed his body's decay into the ultimate act of spiritual devotion and submission. As death neared, Philip II summoned his son and heir, Philip III. The young prince was confronted with a terrifying scene. His father, the embodiment of imperial power, was a rotting corpse infested with maggots and emanating a sickening stench. Philip III was reportedly deeply shocked and had to leave the room several times. In a final attempt to impart wisdom, Philip II managed to speak. He extended his gout-twisted hand, pointed to his decomposing body, and uttered his stark warning. "I have been handled like an old dog. Remember this when you wear the crown." It was a cruel valediction about the vanity of earthly power and a psychological burden placed upon his successor. Philip II finally died at 5 a.m. on September 13, 1598, having requested that his father's crucifix be placed on his chest. The immediate cause of death was overwhelming sepsis and multi-organ failure. Upon his passing, the court faced a severe problem. The body was in such an advanced state of decomposition that traditional royal embalming was impossible. His casket was sealed urgently and swiftly moved to the royal crypt in El Escorial. Philip had been conquered, not by gold or steel, but by bacteria, abscesses, and maggots. The horrific nature of Philip II's death was immediately sensationalized, particularly in Protestant countries, where it was seen as divine retribution. Conversely, the Spanish chroniclers implemented a rigid historical cover-up, omitting all details of the stench and the maggots, focusing solely on the king's piety and fortitude. However, the story of the maggots and the decay endured. It became an eternal memento mori. Remember that you must die. The deep psychological trauma inflicted on Philip III led him to become an indolent and reluctant ruler, heavily reliant on validos, or favorites. His retreat from his father's obsessive work ethic marked the beginning of the slow decline of the Spanish Empire. Philip II's death ultimately proved that absolute power cannot purchase immunity from the absolute law of decay. Philip's suffering was not just physical, it was deeply political and theological. He firmly believed his throne was divinely ordained, making his illness a public test of his sacred status. The sight of the King of Spain, the most powerful Catholic monarch, the most Catholic king, being consumed by vermin and decay was used as potent propaganda by his Protestant enemies. Their pamphlets across England and the Netherlands painted his death as God's judgment against the Spanish Inquisition and his tyrannical rule. In response, the Spanish court redoubled its efforts to frame his agony as heroic martyrdom, elevating his patience to a saintly level to counteract the devastating political damage. The court constantly contrasted Philip's death with that of his father, Emperor Charles V. Charles V, who had voluntarily abdicated, meticulously planned his final years and even rehearsed his own funeral before passing away in a monastery, maintaining a carefully curated dignity. Philip, conversely, was caught off guard and incapacitated by a disease he could not preempt. This stark difference amplified the tragedy. Philip's aides desperately tried to replicate Charles V's pious environment, but the stench and the physical horror of Philip's wounds, details utterly absent in Charles V's dignified end, made the comparison impossible to sustain, underscoring the unprecedented nature of his humiliation. The daily routine in the royal chamber became a terrifying ballet of devotion and revulsion. Attendants had to perform what were called ablutions, acts of cleansing and dressing the wounds. These were not quick tasks. They were long, painful procedures that often required 3 or 4 men to gently reposition the king's fragile, rigid body. To manage the smell, elaborate rituals of burning incense, frankincense, and myrrh were constant, creating a thick, fragrant smoke that momentarily masked the decay but added to the suffocating heat and discomfort. Despite these desperate measures, the infection was relentless, and the sight of the king's bed, saturated with sweat, discharge, and blood, became a grim centerpiece. As Philip's condition worsened, hope among the medical staff vanished, replaced by a desperate scramble for unorthodox remedies. The physicians, having exhausted their knowledge of humors and phlebotomy, resorted to increasingly exotic and superstitious applications. They applied crushed pearls, precious stones, and even ground unicorn horn, likely narwhal tusk, expensive, symbolic remedies believed to possess healing properties. These measures, representing the highest cost and lowest efficacy, underscore the era's medical limitations and the profound sense of hopelessness that permeated the royal chamber. The king's body was treated as both a decaying vessel and a sacred reliquary, subject to both biological decay and magical belief. Following Philip's death, the necessary rites of passage were executed with haste. The immediate need was to seal the body, bypassing traditional embalming due to the state of decomposition. The scene was enveloped in a silence that was almost as profound as the preceding screams and chaos. The king's casket, heavy with the burden of his reign, was solemnly and swiftly transferred to the pantheon of kings beneath El Escorial. The official narrative focused entirely on his heroic patience and saintly endurance, solidifying the cover-up. The vast granite mausoleum, which Philip had so meticulously prepared for his entire family, ultimately received him not as a triumphant sovereign, but as a victim of the most visceral and humbling biological defeat.